Paranormal in Pennsylvania may discuss topics such as suicide, murder, and other potentially upsetting things. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to Paranormal in Pennsylvania.
Where we discuss history and hauntings.
Today's story is a deviation from a location, but it's about haunted fashion. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Erica.
Let's get into it. So, haunted fashion. I'm so excited for this. It was actually suggested, I think, in season one to us, maybe by one of our friends.
Yeah,
And I just kind of kept it on the back burner. Uh,
yeah,
I am thrilled to be doing it.
me
It,
too. I'm excited to hear about it.
yeah. And so I was looking for, it's more like spooky fashion, I would say. Uh,
Yes.
there is some hauntings related to costumes, but I couldn't find any like overall, like this costume was haunted. But it will be a slight deviation from the normal, obviously, of history and haunting, because it's just going to be three separate topics with the history and like the spookiness woven in throughout. So, first, I think this is something most people are familiar with, but it's Mad Hatter syndrome. Have you heard of it?
You know what? I know that I've heard of it, but I don't remember what it is right now.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, if they haven't heard of it, think that the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland is just like a whimsical character, but the Mad Hatter is actually a reflection of this like spooky fashion thing, which is cool.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, so he's a real phenomenon. In the 18th and 19th centuries, hats were made using rabbit fur. That's why he's like a rabbit. And the fur was converted into felt using a process that involved brushing mercury on it. So they would take like my understanding is like boar bristle brushes, and it would be like really fluffy. They would dip it in mercury and then they would make it into more like a felt material. You might know mercury is incredibly poisonous. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's harmful via skin contact and as an inhalant as well. So obviously, if they're dipping, even if they have gloves on, if day after day they're dipping a hand in to mercury to brush it, that's really going to cause some bad symptoms. But also, their shops typically in the 18th and 19th century weren't that big. So if you're in a small room with mercury, it's really easy to start inhaling it, you know?
Right. Like I feel like people in the shop, even if they weren't working on the Mercury part of the project, probably still were exposed to it in some capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about that too, like even the shopkeepers, if because I think family-run businesses were pretty common. So imagine it's like, okay, typically it was men that were making the hats because it was men's hats were the fashion of rabbit fur. But imagine it's like, okay, so your like brother, whatever, is working in the back and you're the shopkeeper. You're still, if you're in a little cottage that is constantly having mercury and mercury fumes, you're still gonna start inhaling it. Or if you're selling the hats, even selling it, like you would be touching it constantly, with the mercury.
Yes. Yeah, and then I'm thinking that they're customers. I mean, they're just
Yeah.
spreading mercury throughout the town.
Right. It's so funny to me looking back in history at different things where they're like, well, we don't know what this really does, but it works really well for converting rabbit fur into felt. So let's do it. And so, one of the first symptoms of this Hatter syndrome due to the mercury poisoning was trembling. And this would typically lead to like the madness part of it because people would get really, really frustrated that they were shaking because it's hard to be a hat maker if you can't, if you're trembling and stuff. So that was the first step of poisoning. And it was so significant that Danbury, Connecticut, which is known for their rabbit fur hats, they coined the term the Danbury Shakes because everybody there was shaking so much.
Oh my gosh. So, okay, so how long approximately does that stage last? Is that like a long enough one that they coined the term Danbury shakes before people move to the next stage? You know what I'm saying? Like,
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. Like, yeah, it's kind of morbid if they're like, it's the Danbury Shakes, and then you die, you know?
Yeah. Like,
I mean, I don't know. That's interesting because it like progresses, I think, quickly from that, but the symptoms are less visible. So, like
okay.
shaking, you can see, but then the next big symptom is becoming extremely paranoid, which also contributes to the mad part of the Mad Hatter. And accounts of hatters would often say that they would have random outbursts of anger, followed by periods of extreme paranoia about the anger, which, I'm not a Mad Hatter, but it is relatable to me. Like
I
overthinking.
yes.
And so they would slowly go mad and they would be hard to work with, which could lead to them losing some of the people, if they had like an intern or whatever, or not an intern, an apprentice, it would probably be, then they would leave, which would mean the main hatter was doing more of the work, just therefore like making the cycle worse and worse. Eventually, the mercury would cause cardiac and respiratory problems and the loss of teeth, which was interesting to me because I think a lot of these things make sense to me. Like it's affecting the neurological system with the trembling. Okay. And that could be playing a role in the paranoia if your transmitters are not working well. No one quote me on this. I have not looked into the mechanisms of this. I'm just guessing. And then the respiratory and cardiac problems make sense if you're inhaling it. But the loss of teeth was the one I was like, how does that contribute? Like, how does mercury contribute to that?
This reminds me of something that I've heard recently, which is that your teeth are the only part of your skull, of your bones that are like exposed, which really freaked me out to begin with because I was like, I don't like that at all. But maybe it has something to do with like the way that it affects bones, and that's
Maybe.
what's being affected by the mercury. Because you wouldn't know it unless somebody had an exposed bone elsewhere.
Oh, that's true. That's a good point. I was thinking if it's cardiac, maybe it has something to do with like the blood flow to the connections, which I
Mm,
mean, it could be, we're not doctors. It could be either.
no.
Um, but yeah, I think it's really interesting. Also, that's a good point about teeth being different because they're the only part that's exposed, but they're also the only part, I think, the only part of our body that can't regenerate itself. I think the optical nerve might also be in that category, but teeth are at least
Ah.
one of, if not the only, parts of the body that can't regenerate itself. That's why they always say, like, you have to take care of your teeth. Not that you know anything about taking care of your teeth.
So
But
much.
yeah, I know. You're like, I feel like you're so serious about it. Erica's always flossing for everybody listening. Like every time, as long as I've known her, she'll eat lunch and then she'll go floss. Like she really takes care of her teeth. Um, and so yeah, I just think that was an interesting one. I just picture this like old man sitting in a cottage making hats, like whispering to himself with no teeth and like he can't
Yeah.
breathe. And it's why would you continue doing it? Is my question.
I don't know because I feel like, you go so long in your life without these issues, you start making hats and they start happening. There has to be some kind of connection in your brain, like this is what's causing it, right? Because I think like
Hmm.
even as something as small as like skincare, if I introduce a new lotion and I break out, immediately I'm like, oh, okay, it was a new lotion. So I'm surprised that either either they didn't realize it, or in my opinion, more likely, maybe they just didn't have an option because it was the only way they
Yeah.
were making money.
That's something I thought about. Like, what are you gonna do if your family has is a family of hat makers? What are you gonna do for income? It's not like there
Right.
were tons of diverse options there, especially because I'm sure it was a very lucrative job to have.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And many hatters died at an early age, which is crazy to me that they died at an earlier age for the 18th century. Like, what was it, like 10? It's
Oh
like,
my God, you're right.
yeah, obviously that's hyperbolizing it, but seriously, it's like if people lived to like 40, were people dying at 20 and no one was like, all the hat makers die at 20. You know, again, it's like
Yeah.
critical thinking.
Right.
Yeah. And maybe, I mean, I
What?
guess things were really different back then. Like, we only really, like, think of how bad Pittsburgh was back then. And people were like, this coal
Yes.
dust, it's fine. So maybe it's just a different culture now.
A different era.
And the thing that, like, when I was researching this, I was like, okay, there must be some law, right? Like, in the 60s, when we started really figuring out that this was the mercury was causing it, there must have been some law created against this. Nope, actually. It only went out of style because men's hats went out of style in the 1960s. And actually, traditional hat making with mercury is still legal in Britain.
I have no clue why that would not. I mean, okay, so if it's not an issue anymore, then maybe it's just not worth like creating the law
Right.
for it. But like, if there's any businesses that are still doing it, and I can't imagine that there are, but like, there's got to be something to prevent that.
Right. I just thought it was crazy that it was like, and it went out of style because men's hats went out of style, which is interesting to me because I think we're coming back to a point where men's hats are in style, but I think we've just changed so much from handmade stuff to mass marketing that no one's going to make mercury hats anymore. Um,
Right.
but yeah, it's interesting to me that there's no legislation against it.
Yeah, especially if there's this much historical information, it's not like it's not pertinent. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Right. And I guess it's not like the FDA regulates clothing, you know. I was trying to
Oh,
think of
that's
like
fair.
who would have legislation over it because it's a chemical, but hmm, I don't know. So that is Mad Hatter syndrome. We have another like crazy no one figured this out story, which is royal green dye. Had you ever heard of this? Like royal green? I hadn't either. And David, when
No.
I was researching for the episode, I was like, yeah, if you have any like spooky fashion ideas, then let me know. And he was like, oh, yeah, royal green dye. And it was really common in England. And I was like, do you know this because your family's from England? Like, why do you know this? But it was widely used specifically in Victorian England, and it was arsenic. So I know. If you use arsenic as a dye, it turns fabric bright green.
Oh
So,
my goodness. Did they know at the time that it was poison or literally was it just arsenic and then
so I think so because when I was researching like arsenic use in Victorian England, it talked about the poison rings and stuff that people would use to hold arsenic so people knew it was poison, but I'm wondering if people didn't know that it would seep into the bloodstream through clothing if they thought you had to ingest it. Because some things are that way, but arsenic is just not one of them. And it was
oh
so
my
such a
gosh.
widely desired color that everything from shoes to gloves to dresses were dyed with this color. And something really interesting is, I guess in Victorian England, women used to wear artificial wreaths as decorative pieces around their head, kind of I'm thinking like a Coachella crown thing, you know? But
Yeah.
I figured, okay, well, that's just in December, right? Because holidays, wreaths. Nope, it was all the time. Because they would decorate them with fake flowers and stuff. And to get this color, they would paint the fake leaves in arsenic, or if it was silk leaves, they would dye it in arsenic.
So it's on their head?
Yes, it's on their head. And they were
Oh,
particularly an issue because they were sharper. If you think of like a wreath versus a dress, wreaths have sharper edges and it can be more agitating to the skin. So it would
oh.
literally break open their skin on their skull and allow the arsenic to seep directly into the bloodstream in their head.
I feel so terrible for these poor women who probably, who assumedly just had no idea what was happening
Right.
because they're just trying to keep up with the fashion, which, and I say that like non-judgmentally, like that is, first of all, I like doing that now. But
Right.
secondly, that was the main rage. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
Like that was their kind of society, was keeping up with these fashions as time went on. And so they almost didn't have another option. Either that or they just kind of like didn't go with the trends, which I think is like a
Right.
which I think was like a faux pas.
Right. And that's what I was thinking too, because it's specifically called royal green dye. And so I think it was like upper class and royalty that primarily wore this color. So I'm sure that people that were like lower middle class were trying to do anything to get their hands on a dress that was this color. So you're right. It's like, what are you going to do? Be shunned? Or are you going to wear an arsenic wreath on your head? Especially back then when status was everything.
Right. Yes, thank you. That was literally the sentence I was trying to get to, and I could not find it.
So, although it was dangerous to the wearer, like we were saying with hats, manufacturers also are going to suffer from these types of things. So, people that worked in places that manufactured clothing with arsenic dyes or the accessories died really terrible deaths. And this is everybody in the manufacturing plant. So, it's not just the people handling the dye, because there would be so much of it that the fumes would really affect everyone. So, you could be a regular delivery person that's coming in and out every day, and you could still have some really horrible effects, which is sad.
Oh, yeah.
Deaths include convulsions, vomiting, and foaming at the mouth, which is crazy to me.
Yeah, that's very intense.
And again, it's like, I know people died early and like people didn't care about labor laws or whatever, but for your own self-preservation, do you not work at an arsenic plant and think, all of my coworkers are dying these very horrible, violent deaths. Maybe I should consider other careers. But I mean, you made a good point with the hats of maybe they just don't have options, you know? This is what they do. They're specialized in arsenic dye and now they have to do it.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting. It's an interesting perspective because obviously, when it comes to our careers now, most of the time, we really don't have to think about life or death, you know? So it's like
Mhm.
a, if we even feel, I mean, to be fair, people do have the issue today. It's just to a lesser extent of like, okay, I'm really stressed out by this job, but I quite literally can't get another one
Mhm.
and I can't quit, you know? And so it's like
Right.
we kind of feel that way, but it isn't like super life or death like it was back then. So I feel
Mhm.
like I would have been like, no, I don't want to die, but I've never had that stake.
Right. Right. I'm trying to think of other things like, you remember that series like Dirty Jobs
I
on.
do.
Yeah, and a lot of them weren't just dirty, they were like straight up dangerous. But I feel like
Yes.
oftentimes when he would interview the people and ask why they did those jobs, it's because they were really lucrative. Like I'm thinking of like lobster fishing or whatever, where you have to like go up to the Arctic and it's really dangerous. It's like, well, they go up there for a month a year and they make like $200,000 or something crazy. So I think you're right that it does still happen to a lesser extent, but it's more of an option for people nowadays to do these things based on like the cost benefit of income versus risk. Uh, but I
Right.
also think like with all of the protections that we have in place, it should hopefully be a little better where they're not like, you need to keep working in an arsenic plant, like
Yes.
crazy.
Yeah.
And the some of these people that died from arsenic poisoning, they actually ran testing on them post-mortem, like very far post-mortem, and traces of arsenic could be found in their stomach, liver, under their fingernails, and in their lungs. So it was really ubiquitous throughout their systems.
Oh my gosh. That's so
I
far
know.
spread.
I know, and if you think of your liver, like your liver is so important for filtering out toxins. Imagine
Oh,
if it's trying to filter out arsenic on top of doing its regular stuff, on top of like if they were drinking or anything or consuming any other toxin, it's like their poor livers were just,
I know.
yeah. And I thought stomach was interesting too because I was like, how did it get there? But then when I read it would be under their fingernails, that makes sense. If you're eating, you're literally eating the arsenic if it's under your fingernails.
Yes. And
Yeah.
can you imagine nail biters back then?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Oh my
As
gosh. That's a
someone
great
who bit
point.
my nails for like 20 years. That was the first place my mind went. Like you shouldn't do it now. And I can't even imagine biting your nails back then.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great point. Or like skin picking. If they picked
Oh,
at their skin, like it's just right into your bloodstream. Wow. Very interesting. I hadn't considered those things. This, like hats, kind of just went out of fashion, and that's how people got away from it. The specific color went out of fashion in the late 1800s because claims were made that it was killing people. So at least there
okay.
was some reflection in this one.
Yeah.
It was like, I think this color is killing people. Let's stop wearing it.
Yeah.
So the next one is more of like haunted, I guess. I don't know.
hmm
None of these are like traditional hauntings, I would say. This one's kind of just karma. And it's the original Wizard of Oz movie. And there's two really interesting things about the costuming in this movie. And I know that there's like a whole lot of controversy about the movie. Like apparently Judy Garland was like on cocaine or something during it. Have you heard that?
I have, and then I heard that the snow in the scene where they're like about to reach the castle was just asbestos.
Cool. Very good.
So yeah, not great quality safety on
Yeah.
that movie set.
There was no OSHA. And this film came out in 1939. So if you think about filming it, mid 1930s, very different standards. So I'm going to talk about the Tin Man and the Lion. And I didn't realize that some of this stuff was really common knowledge until I started talking to people about it, but a lot of people knew these stories, which is cool. Maybe I'm late to the game. So, to get the metallic look of the original Tin Man, who was played by Buddy Ebsen, he was actually painted with pure aluminum, which, like, I can't even say with a straight face because it sounds so ridiculous to me.
It's so funny because I have never thought once about that costume when I've watched the movie afterwards once in my life, but as soon as you said Tin Man, I was like, Erica, how did you not put that together that that was a dangerous costume?
Well, because yeah, on top of it being literally just sharp, we don't think about it, I think, because movie magic now, it's like you could get silver face paint, like, like we have silver
Yes.
eyeshadow and stuff, and it's not bad for us. And we have silver fabric that could be constructed into something like a Tin Man outfit. So I feel like we just don't think about it. But I didn't know the actual date of The Wizard of Oz. I knew it was an old movie, but I didn't realize it was 1930s. And that's like very
Mm.
different. Wow, it's almost 100 years old. That's crazy. As you might suspect, aluminum is incredibly dangerous, causing a wide variety of issues, and primarily inhaling it, which would happen because obviously they were like painting his nose and face, and as it dries, it would become more of a powdery substance that he would inhale. But then, because his skin was showing, they would just paint on more. So it's like, and they would film very, very long days because, again, there was no worker guidelines back then. So he was actually hospitalized for 2 weeks and he was on oxygen the whole time due to this aluminum dust. He also had severe cramping in his hands, arms, and legs. So it was causing, I think that's probably because of like the lack of oxygen, but there might be another mechanism. Um, and it was saying he struggled to breathe so much during his time at the hospital that he could barely talk.
That's so scary to
Hmm.
think that, you're doing a movie. It's I don't remember who the actor is, but it might be your big break. And then these are the consequences afterwards. It reminds me of Rocky Horror when I found out that at the end when they're all kind of swimming in the pool, it
Oh,
was
yeah.
like ice water and they ended up getting pneumonia. And I was like,
Hmm.
that's so scary. It's like you're so affected by these things that should be like achievements, accomplishments, like
Yeah.
beneficial things in your life.
Right. I think learning about the like behind the scenes of movies, stuff like that, it's so interesting to me. This is like a shameless plug for Horror Hour with the Hannahs because we've collabed with them, we're personal friends, and I genuinely like their podcast. But I feel like I learn about all of these horror movies like Rocky Horror, which arguably is not a horror movie, but whatever.
Right.
But I learned about all these movies, I'll say, that had these crazy conditions on set that you would never know about when you just, see it and you think, oh, they're swimming in a pool. And it's really cool that they talk about like, nope, this is what actually happened behind the scenes. Cause I love stuff like that. That's why I loved this like dive into The Wizard of Oz. And to make this story even worse, the studio demanded that he return to work because it was costing them money to not film, but he literally couldn't breathe, so he could not go back to work. So they gave his part away. I know. I know when you were like, it could be your big break. I was like, it was not.
That's so sad. And also, why wouldn't I mean, okay, let me ask this question. I don't know if this was in the information, but like, did they then redo the costume to be safer, or did they just put somebody else in the aluminum?
So they did change it. So, well, not the costume, just the paint.
Gotcha.
Jack Haley took over for Buddy and they changed the makeup used. So it was not pure aluminum. I guess it was more of like a paint, which still doesn't sound great. But
Right.
he did still suffer severe eye infections and almost lost his vision, which is where like the haunting comes in because people say that this is karma for taking the position from Buddy while he was in the hospital.
Oh my goodness. You
Yeah,
know what? I get why people say that. I also am like it might fall more on the director slash casting individuals of the
right.
movie rather than the actor.
Well, that's what I was thinking too. It's like this Wizard of Oz movie is huge. So,
Yeah.
who's not going to take a role in it?
Yes. And okay, so I did not know that they had two different actors. Did they refilm buddy scenes with Jack?
Jack. Yeah, I don't know. It didn't say. I kind of we should watch it and see if we can notice like a difference. I wonder if you would notice though, because you'd have to really watch their face because the Tin Man's face is like just that circle, and
Yes.
their movements aren't going to be very indicative of anything because they're just like a Tin Man.
Robotic. Yeah.
Yeah, we should see though. I wonder if we can point it out. But that's not it. This, because there's tons of controversy around The Wizard of Oz. So,
Right.
another haunted, creepy part of this movie is the lion costume. It was made from real lion pelts.
What?
I know, I had no clue. And I just don't understand why. Like, that must have been so expensive to do. Not
Yes.
right, because back then people like cared less about endangered animals, ethical, whatever. Just thinking of it from a cost perspective, that must have been crazy.
Well, when we visited that house in Savannah, there
Hmm.
was that leopard print on
Yes.
the couch. Why can I not think of the name?
The Mercer
The Mercer
Williams.
Williams. Yes, there was that lion pelt on the couch, and it just that and like the elephant tusks on the thing. I mean, these things were widely coveted at the time.
Hmm. Yeah, that's true. So maybe
So
it was the
that must
more
have been
normal,
so expensive. Oh
right?
no, I agree with you. Like that must have been crazy expensive to get a full lion pelt.
Yeah, but maybe it was more normal in terms of because like right now I'm like, I don't know a lion pelt dealer. So, but back
That's
then maybe
fair.
it was more common of like a wild animal dealer. I
Mm,
don't know. You know what I mean?
yes.
And the costume itself was miserable because it weighed 90 pounds and was incredibly warm. And the actor that wore it sweat so much that they used to have to wring it out at the end of the day. And it started to smell like it was rotting by the end of filming, which it might have been. And there was no real way to clean it because they didn't want to like ruin the pelts because it was expensive. And so he had to just deal with it.
That sounds the last day of filming. I can't even imagine what it smelled like.
I can't imagine like not only being them, but working with him. Like, think of
Yeah.
being like Judy Garland and you're like, oh, I have to stand next to this person that literally smells like a rotting lion. What?
And at the end of the movie, she hugs him. So if they filmed that in order, that is not great.
That's what I was thinking. Like the scene where they're in the air balloon and they're like really tight together. I was like, oh my
Yes.
God, it must have been crazy. Like, don't cut yourself on the Tin Man. Don't get any of his makeup on you. And the lion smells like a literal dead lion. It's
Yeah.
crazy to me.
Oh.
So those were all my major stories. I do want to give a shout out to whalebone corsets. I didn't fully dive into it because I found a lot of conflicting information on it, but I don't know if you know that corsets used to be made of whale bones. Like the boning in it was real bones.
Oh my gosh.
Hmm.
I did not.
Yeah. And that's crazy to me. Like who thought of that, you know?
I don't know. Why are we so Oh, wait, no. Why are we so heck bent on using animals for everything?
Yeah, I mean, I felt that with a lot of these things. Like, how did people discover mercury helps with rabbit pelts? How did people discover arsenic produces a green color? Was it just an accident and like something fell into arsenic? Why do you have a vat of arsenic? You know?
Yeah. Yes. Good questions.
So those are all of the haunted, spooky fashion things I had. Is there anything you had heard of that you wanted to add? If not, that's fine.
No, I am so happy we talked about Wizard of Oz. I really like the behind the scenes stories, and I had not heard of any of those. So
Hmm.
that was super, super interesting.
Yeah, I think so too. Like I said, I was really hoping to find like a haunted costume. And I found a lot of like haunted film sets, but nothing linked specifically to the costumes. So if anybody listening has a story about haunted costumes, let us know. Because that's what I originally thought I would be able to find. But instead, it's just like spooky fashion. And I was kind of hoping that, like, with the whalebone corsets or the lion pelt, that it would be like, and he constantly heard the roar of a lion from behind him. But that was not the case. I just thought it would have been cool. Or like, and the women that wore the corsets constantly heard whale songs because it's like, you should, like you deserve to deal
Yes.
with that. Yeah, so I hope everybody has enjoyed this little special feature of haunted, spooky fashion. It's a little different than our normal episodes. Let us know what you think in the comment sections. Send us a message. Follow us on Instagram at Paranormal in Pennsylvania to see behind the scenes content and learn first when new episodes drop. And stay spooky.